For 13 years, my wife's family called me the charity case. When I got rich, they suddenly didn't remember signing a prenup. Her aunt even brought a lawyer to dinner. So I smiled, unzipped my bag, and what I pulled out left every one of them speechless. Let me start from the beginning. I, 35M, grew up poor. Not just working class poor, but the kind of poor where you eat ramen for weeks and pretend it's a choice. When I met my wife at 22, I was working 2 jobs just to afford my studio apartment. She was everything I wasn't: wealthy family, private school education, trust fund. But somehow, she saw something in me. Her family? They saw a charity case. For 13 years, I endured their comments. At every family gathering, her father would ask if I'd finally found a real job, while sipping wine that cost more than my monthly rent. Her mother would smile sweetly and suggest I might be more comfortable staying home during their country club events. The worst was her Aunt Patricia, who never missed a chance to remind everyone how generous they were being by accepting me into the family. They called me the help when they thought I couldn't hear. They whispered about their poor daughter being trapped with someone beneath her station. They made jokes about prenups and gold diggers, not knowing that my wife and I had actually signed one before our wedding, ironically, at their insistence. I took it all because I loved her. My wife defended me sometimes, but family pressure wore her down. She started suggesting I network with her father's business contacts, hinting that maybe I should be more ambitious. The subtle message was clear: I wasn't enough. But I had been working on something. For 8 years, during those quiet hours after my day jobs, I'd been developing software. Nothing glamorous, just a data management system for small businesses. I taught myself programming, spent every spare dollar on development, and slowly built something I believed in. 3 months ago, everything changed. A major corporation acquired my software for $12 million. I didn't tell anyone immediately. I needed time to process it, to plan. My wife knew something had changed when I paid off our mortgage and started driving a new car, but I downplayed it. I told her I'd sold some software and made decent money. She seemed pleased, but distracted. Her family had been pressuring her about our financial future again. Last week, her Aunt Patricia called my wife with exciting news. The family had been discussing our situation, and they'd decided to help us out. Patricia had spoken to a lawyer friend who specialized in postnuptial agreements. They were concerned about my wife's financial security and thought it might be time to revisit our prenup. My wife seemed uncomfortable when she brought this up to me. She explained that her family was worried about her future, especially if something happened to me or if we ever divorced. They wanted to ensure she'd be taken care of. Patricia had even offered to pay for the lawyer. I listened carefully as my wife explained their proposal. They wanted to nullify our original prenup, the one they'd insisted on, and create a new agreement that would protect my wife's interests. Of course, they assumed I had nothing to protect. I told my wife I'd think about it, but I was already making plans. When Patricia suggested we all meet for dinner to discuss it properly, I agreed immediately. She seemed surprised by my enthusiasm, but pleased that I was finally being reasonable about my wife's needs. The dinner was set for last Saturday at Patricia's house. She mentioned she'd invited her lawyer friend to join us, just to answer any questions. My wife looked mortified, but I assured her it was fine. I even offered to bring dessert. Saturday arrived, and I dressed carefully, my best suit, the one I'd bought for our wedding. I carried my old leather messenger bag, the same one I'd used throughout college and my early career. My wife kept apologizing for her family's behavior, but I told her not to worry. Tonight, everything would be different. Patricia's house was exactly what you'd expect: pristine, expensive, designed to impress. The family was already gathered: Patricia and her husband, my wife's parents, her brother and his wife, and a sharp-looking woman in her 50s who was introduced as the lawyer. The conversation started pleasantly enough. Patricia asked about my work, and I explained that business was going well. Her father inquired about my little software project, and I mentioned it had been profitable. They all nodded politely, clearly thinking in terms of thousands, maybe tens of thousands. During the main course, Patricia brought up the real reason for the dinner. She explained how concerned they all were about my wife's future security. The lawyer jumped in, discussing how the original prenup was outdated and potentially unfair to my wife. She had papers with her, she said, and we could take care of everything tonight. My wife looked increasingly uncomfortable as her family outlined their plan. They'd obviously discussed this extensively without her input. The new agreement would ensure she received significant financial support in case of divorce and would inherit substantial assets. They kept emphasizing how this would protect her from being left with nothing. I listened to every word, nodding occasionally, asking thoughtful questions about the legal implications. The lawyer seemed impressed by my understanding of the terms. Patricia beamed, probably thinking she'd finally managed to teach the charity case some sense. Then Patricia made her mistake. She leaned back in her chair, wine glass in hand, and smiled at me with that condescending expression I'd seen 1,000 times. She told me how proud she was that I was finally thinking about my wife's welfare instead of being selfish. She said it showed real maturity, real growth. Then she added that she knew this might be hard for my ego, but sometimes a man had to admit when he was out of his league. The room went quiet. My wife's face was burning with embarrassment. Her parents looked uncomfortable. Even the lawyer seemed to sense the tension. I set down my fork and reached for my messenger bag. I told them they were absolutely right about one thing. The original prenup was outdated. Things had changed significantly since we signed it. I unzipped the bag slowly, building the suspense. Patricia was still smiling, probably expecting me to pull out some humble financial documents that would prove their point. Instead, I pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table. The top document was clearly visible, a bank statement showing a balance of $11,847,329. The silence was deafening. Patricia's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Her father leaned forward, squinting at the papers as if they might be fake. The lawyer's professional composure cracked slightly. I explained calmly that my software had been acquired 3 months ago. I outlined the terms of the deal, the initial payment, the ongoing royalties, the consulting contract. I mentioned the investment opportunities one was exploring and the additional income streams I'd developed. My wife stared at me, clearly shocked. She asked why I hadn't told her about the full extent of the sale. I explained that I'd wanted to be sure everything was finalized before making any announcements. I also mentioned that I'd been curious to see how her family would react to our financial troubles. Patricia found her voice first. She started backtracking immediately, claiming she'd always believed in me and that this was wonderful news for everyone. Her husband jumped in, suddenly remembering all the encouraging things he'd supposedly said about my career prospects. The lawyer cleared her throat and mentioned that obviously, the new prenup would need significant revisions given this new information. She started discussing asset protection and tax implications. I pulled out another document, a copy of our original prenup. I explained that I'd had my own lawyer review it recently, and it was actually quite comprehensive. It protected both parties' assets acquired before marriage and outlined clear terms for anything acquired during marriage. Under the original agreement, my wife would be entitled to half of everything I'd earned during our marriage, minus my business assets that predated our relationship. Given that the software development had begun before our wedding, there were some complex calculations involved, but she would still be entitled to several $1,000,000 in case of divorce. I looked directly at Patricia and asked if she still thought the prenup needed to be changed to protect my wife's interests. The lawyer started asking technical questions about the timing of my software development and when various assets were created. I pulled out more documents, development logs, copyright filings, early investment records. I'd been meticulous about documentation, partly out of habit and partly because I'd always known this moment might come. Patricia's husband tried to change the subject, suggesting we celebrate my success instead of focusing on legal matters. He offered to open a bottle of champagne. My wife's mother suddenly remembered how she'd always encouraged my entrepreneurial spirit. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out one more document, a report from a private investigator. For the past month, I'd been documenting every comment, every slight, every family gathering where I'd been excluded or dismissed. I had photos of events I hadn't been invited to, recordings of conversations where they discussed my unsuitability for their daughter. I explained that I'd been considering filing a defamation lawsuit, particularly against Patricia, who had been the most vocal about her opinions regarding my character and prospects. I mentioned that I'd already consulted with several law firms about the impact their treatment had on my professional reputation. The room was completely silent now. Patricia's face had gone pale. The lawyer was frantically taking notes, probably calculating her own liability for being involved in what now looked like a potential conspiracy to defraud me. My wife finally spoke up. She asked why I'd let this go on for so long. why I'd subjected myself to their treatment when I could have stopped it at any time. I told her the truth. I wanted to see who they really were. I wanted to understand whether their treatment of me was based on legitimate concerns about my character or simply prejudice about my background. I wanted to know if they loved their daughter enough to treat her husband with respect, regardless of his bank account. Now I knew. I stood up and started packing my documents back into the bag. I thanked Patricia for the dinner and told the lawyer that her services wouldn't be needed after all. I mentioned that I'd be happy to discuss any legal matters through my own attorneys going forward. Patricia tried one last desperate attempt at reconciliation. She insisted that they'd always cared about me, that their concerns had been misunderstood. She claimed they were just trying to protect their daughter and that they'd always seen potential in me. I smiled and told her I was sure she believed that. Then I mentioned that I'd be making some significant changes to my estate planning and charitable giving. I was particularly interested in supporting organizations that helped young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. I thought it would be meaningful to give back to people who faced the same challenges I had. The implication was clear. Their daughter's inheritance prospects had just shifted dramatically. As my wife and I prepared to leave, the family made awkward attempts at normalcy. Patricia's husband shook my hand and muttered something about being glad things had worked out. My wife's father cleared his throat and mentioned that they should have dinner again soon, maybe at the country club this time. I told them that sounded lovely, but I'd need to check my schedule. I had several board meetings coming up and was considering some investment opportunities overseas. The drive home was quiet. My wife finally asked if I was angry with her for not standing up to her family more forcefully. I told her I understood that family relationships were complicated, but that things would need to change going forward. She asked what I meant. I explained that I wouldn't tolerate disrespect anymore from anyone. I'd spent 13 years proving myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worthy of their consideration. I'd achieved more than most of them ever would, and I'd done it without their help or approval. I told her that I loved her, but that our relationship had been affected by her family's treatment and her failure to consistently defend me. I suggested we consider marriage counseling to work through these issues. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if I would have left her if the software deal hadn't happened. I told her honestly that I'd been considering it. The constant humiliation had been wearing me down, and I'd started to wonder if she truly respected me or if she was just comfortable with the relationship. The money changed things, but not in the way her family assumed. It gave me options I hadn't had before. It gave me the power to demand respect instead of hoping for it. Update 1. The week after the dinner was interesting. Patricia called my wife 3 times, ostensibly to check in, but obviously fishing for more details about my financial situation. My wife's mother sent a gift basket with a note about how proud she was of my success. The lawyer called my wife directly, claiming she wanted to discuss the legal implications of my new wealth and offering her services for estate planning. I had my attorney contact her firm and make it clear that any further communication should go through proper channels. My wife seemed genuinely shocked by her family's immediate pivot. She said she'd always known they were concerned about money, but she hadn't realized how transactional their affection was. I started making some concrete changes. I opened investment accounts, hired a financial advisor, and began looking into business opportunities. I also started documenting everything more carefully, not out of paranoia, but because I'd learned the value of being prepared. My wife and I began couples counseling. She admitted that she'd gotten used to her family's behavior and had stopped seeing how wrong it was. She apologized for not defending me more consistently and asked what she could do to rebuild my trust. I told her that actions mattered more than words. I wanted to see her establish boundaries with her family and make it clear that disrespecting me was no longer acceptable. Update 2. 2 weeks later, Patricia hosted another family gathering. This time, I was specifically invited, and the invitation mentioned that they wanted to properly celebrate my success. I decided to attend, curious about how they'd handle the situation. The difference was remarkable. Patricia's husband offered me expensive cigars and wanted to discuss investment strategies. My wife's father asked about my business plans and mentioned some opportunities he thought might interest me. Everyone seemed eager to demonstrate their newfound respect, but I'd learned to pay attention to details. When Patricia thought I was out of earshot, she whispered to my wife about the importance of protecting family assets. Her father mentioned to my wife's brother that they should stay close to us during this transition. They weren't respecting me. They were managing me. During dinner, Patricia brought up estate planning again. She suggested that my wife and I should consider setting up trusts for future children and mentioned that her lawyer friend specialized in family wealth management. I thanked her for the suggestion and mentioned that I'd already begun working with a wealth management firm. I'd also been consulting with tax attorneys about the most efficient ways to structure my assets. Then I dropped the real news. I decided to establish a foundation focused on educational opportunities for low-income students. I was planning to donate a significant portion of my wealth over the next decade. The table went quiet again. Patricia asked how much I was planning to donate. I smiled and said I hadn't finalized the numbers yet, but I was thinking somewhere in the seven-figure range annually. My wife's father cleared his throat and mentioned that it was important to balance charitable giving with family security. He suggested I should ensure my wife's future was protected before making major philanthropic commitments. I told him I appreciated his concern, but that my wife and I would make those decisions together. I mentioned that she'd actually been very supportive of the foundation idea and had offered to help with the planning. This was true. My wife had been enthusiastic about the charitable work when I'd mentioned it during counseling. She'd said it would be meaningful to help other people who faced the challenges I'd overcome. Patricia's expression tightened. She asked if my wife was planning to be involved in managing the foundation. I confirmed that she was considering taking a leadership role, which would give her valuable experience and a sense of purpose. The subtext was clear. My wife wouldn't need their approval or support if she had her own meaningful work and financial independence. Update 3. The final revelation came a month later. My wife's brother called her, supposedly just to chat, but really to probe for more information about our finances. During the conversation, he mentioned that Patricia had been asking about the timeline for my software development. It turns out they'd been consulting with their own lawyer about potential claims against my assets. They'd been trying to determine if any of my software work had been done using family resources or connections that might give them some kind of legal standing. My wife was horrified. She confronted Patricia directly, asking if the family was actually investigating legal action against me. Patricia denied it at first, but eventually admitted they'd sought some preliminary legal advice. She claimed they were just trying to understand the situation and protect everyone's interests. I wasn't surprised. I'd actually been expecting something like this. I called a family meeting at my lawyer's office. I invited Patricia, her husband, my wife's parents, and her brother. I told them we needed to clear the air about some misunderstandings. When they arrived, my attorney was present, along with a court reporter. I explained that I wanted to address their concerns about my assets and make sure everyone understood the legal situation clearly. I presented a complete timeline of my software development, including early code repositories, development logs, and evidence that all work had been done independently using my own resources. I showed records proving that I'd never used family connections for business purposes and had actually declined several offers of help from my wife's relatives. Then I addressed their recent legal inquiries directly. I told them I was aware they'd been consulting attorneys about potential claims against my assets. I wanted to make it clear that any such claims would be frivolous and that I was prepared to defend against them aggressively. My attorney explained that harassment litigation could result in significant legal fees and potential counterclaims. He mentioned that I'd documented years of defamatory statements about my character and prospects, which could form the basis for substantial damages. Patricia tried to backtrack, claiming there had been a misunderstanding. She insisted they'd only sought legal advice to better understand the situation, not to take action against me. I told her I was sure that was true, but that I wanted to be absolutely clear about boundaries going forward. Any further legal inquiries about my assets or business activities would be considered harassment and would result in immediate legal action. I also announced that I'd completed the preliminary paperwork for my foundation. The first grants would focus on providing technology education to underprivileged students. I'd named my wife as the foundation's president, with a generous salary that would make her financially independent. As we left the meeting, my wife was quiet. Finally, she asked if I thought we could ever have a normal relationship with her family. I told her I didn't know, but that it would depend entirely on their willingness to treat both of us with genuine respect. The money had revealed their true character, and now we had to decide whether that was something we could work with. 3 months later, my wife and I renewed our vows in a small ceremony. None of her family attended, by mutual agreement. We'd started fresh, with clear boundaries and honest communication. The foundation has been successful, and my wife loves her work there. We're building a life based on our values, not other people's expectations or assumptions. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never made any money. Would we have survived their constant pressure? Would my wife have eventually started to see me the way they did? I'll never know for sure, but I'm grateful that success gave me the power to demand respect instead of just hoping for it. Money didn't change who I was, but it revealed who everyone else really was. And that knowledge, uncomfortable as it sometimes is, has been worth more than any bank balance.